Welcome to the sew along for the Curious Pouch. Lots of you are going to be here because you have bought the pattern for the pouch and you have scanned the sew along. If you haven't bought the pattern yet, I've left a link in the description below. But welcome to this really detailed, beginner-friendly, super easy sew along so you can make your own Curious Pouch. If you're new around here, I'm Sam from Curious Handmade and I am focused on producing really helpful content around sewing for beginner sewers. I really focus on producing patterns like these and also lots of free hints, tips, sew-alongs so that you can get started on your sewing journey. The Curious Pouch follows the recent really popular launch of my Curious Tote, which is a fabulous analogue bag that helps you live life a little bit more offline by filling it in all the pockets with all the things that you like to do rather than scrolling on your phone. I've created the Curious Pouch because a lot of those analogue activities, like I do, have lots of little bitty things, pens, supplies, jewellery stuff, etc. And so the Curious Pouch is specifically created to either fit into your Curious Tote if you've made it. If you haven't, I'll also link the pattern for that below, or any other bag that you're using as an analogue bag, so you can keep all of your essentials with you on the go. It's also really versatile. People have already been testing this and making it to use as a mum bag, as something to keep medical supplies in. It's brilliant for a wash bag to take on holiday because there's a compartment for everything. Whatever you choose to use it for, I think you will really find it useful. And the thing is, you won't just make one. Once you buy the pattern, you will make loads of these for all different uses in your life. The finished dimensions are roughly 28 centimetres, so 11 inches wide, 19 centimetres or 7.5 inches tall, and about 10 centimetres or 4 inches deep, but that obviously expands once you fill it with all your things. The key features to the Curious Pouch are you've got front pockets and back pockets. The front pockets, you've got one that has a handy flap, so I use this to keep smaller items in. You've got a pocket, you've got larger areas for you to put kind of tools and equipment in, and then there's slots for you to put pens in. All of those are gusseted, so they've got quite good depth on them. On the back are loads more pockets which aren't gusseted, but you can basically, I've done this with pens, you can sew as many lines as you like, so if you want tighter compartments for pens, it's totally flexible. You can do it to suit how you want to make it. Inside, there's even more pockets. So you have the option of creating 3 pockets on one side, 2 pockets on the other. So the beauty of this pouch is once you've learned how to do all the different elements, then it's very much pick and mix. You can choose the elements you want to include. Some of the people I had testing it didn't do pockets inside. They just wanted it completely plain. Some just did the front pocket variations on the front and the back. Some did just these. Whatever works for you, you can make it to suit your individual needs. In terms of the fabric I would suggest making it in, the outer, you want it to be quite robust, but equally you don't want it too thick that if you're sewing on a domestic sewing machine, you won't be able to start sewing where it all gets thicker. So I use a lightweight canvas or a heavier cotton, or you could use a denim or even a corduroy on the outer. And then on the lining, I use a quilting cotton. And that combination works really well for me. I did test it with a canvas on the inside and I could do it because I have an industrial sewing machine, but you will find it very thick to sew over. The zip, I use a nylon zip. You could use a metal zip, but if you do, you'll just need to be really careful when you're sewing over the zip ends. You will also, if you choose to do the pockets, you'll need cam snaps, or you can do buttonholes if you don't have cam snaps. Cam snaps are super easy. In this sew along, I go through step by step how to do all of these, and you'll also need interfacing. The skill level for this, I would say, is confident beginner. If you're a completely new sewer, then I would suggest going and following a lot of my other sew-alongs, really get confident on your machine and then come back and you can do this, because I do, and I say confident beginner because this would normally be an intermediate make, but I go into a lot of detail. I pride myself on the amount of detail I put into the sew-along, video sew-along. So if you're like me and a visual learner, you can use that and you can stop and start it at any time to help clarify things. But also I do really detailed instructions with photos. So whichever works for you, you can watch this sew-along or you can work from the instructions or both. I would say it takes roughly 4 to 6 hours. If you're a confident sewer, that's probably how much time you would need to allow. You'll need to allow longer if you're more new to sewing, but that's fine because, you know, it's actually quite fun just having a make that takes a little bit of time, but one that you will be super proud of in the end. So in terms of the skills you will learn, as well as just learning how to make it, you will be inserting zips, you'll learn how to attach tabs on the end, you will learn how to sew a gusset, which is this additional panel which helps give the pouch its depth. You will also learn how on the inside how to bind the raw edges, so you've got a really nice neat finish. There are no raw edges on this. So this is my finished pouch. Here's another one that I made. This one I keep all my journaling supplies in. This one I keep all of my painting things in, and you can see this is the one I did with canvas inside, and it is lovely, but it was a lot thicker to sew. But it's just so super handy with all of these pockets. I've got my painting items in. The inside of it fits really comfortably a big A5 notebook, so if that's a good indicator for you. So if you do make one, please do post and tag me, tag at Curious Handmade UK. Use the hashtag Curious Pouch so I can find you and share what you make. Our sewing community is fabulous and so many people share what they've made, and it inspires lots of other people in terms of fabric combinations, pocket combinations, etc. So please do share what you make, and if you don't follow already, then do press the subscribe button so that you will get updated on all my free sew-alongs and inspiration, and when I also launch patterns. So without further ado, let's crack on and get stuck into making the Curious Pouch. To get started, you want to open the file that's been downloaded from the pattern that you've purchased. So go to the file on your computer, open it up, and then you'll want to select File, Print, and you want to select just the first page so that we can do a test page, check everything's working okay before we print the whole pattern. Once you've done that, the key thing here is don't click Fit to Page or auto scale or anything. You want to print at 100%, and then you'll know that you're getting it at the correct size. Once you're happy, press Print. When you've got that page, you want to look along the top and you'll see that there are measures in centimetres and inches. And what you want to do is just take your ruler and measure one of those just so that you're checking that it's printing at the correct scale. When you're happy that it is, you can go ahead and print out the whole pattern. Once you've printed all of your pieces of paper, you can check that you've got them all against the flat lay on the front page. You can see that every page is numbered A 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, B 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Once you're happy you've got all of the pages, it's just a case of sticking them together. You can see that every page has got diamonds on all four corners and at the sides, and it's simply a case of cutting off one of the sides so that the diamonds can align. I use this double-sided sticky roller tape. You can use glue or sellotape if you want to, and then just align those diamonds, and once you've got the pattern pieces stuck together, you can cut them all out. To help you with aligning them, you can also look at the pattern lay, and if you're printing on A4, you've only got 15 pages that you need to worry about for this pattern. There's not loads to stick together. For pattern pieces A, E and F, you also need to cut interfacing, and this is indicated by the grey dotted line on the piece, and it's just a centimetre smaller than the actual pattern piece. So you can either just cut out the same size again and then just cut off a centimetre off each side. On the E, just don't cut the centimetre off the end that you're cutting on the fold, if that makes sense. Or if you're planning to make more than one, you could print these 3 pieces again and then just cut out the interfacing size pattern, and that's what I've done, and that just makes it easier because then you've got pattern pieces that you can use to cut out your interfacing, and you can just mark up those pattern pieces with the word interfacing just to distinguish between A for the main fabric and A for the interfacing. Couple of things to point out if you're a beginner sewer. Some of these pieces need to be cut on the fold, and that's clearly outlined on each pattern piece. So do look at the pieces before you line them up on the fabric. Make sure that you're putting them on the grain line, cutting them on the fold where needed before you cut the fabric, just to avoid having to cut the fabric again. So look at what's on the fold, and then once you've cut out your pieces, you also want to transfer the pattern markings. You can do this with chalk or a pen, as long as it's not a heat erasable pen, because you're going
going to be ironing these pieces and those markings will just disappear. So what I find for this pattern is actually easier. It's a little bit more time consuming, but just makes your life so much easier in the end, is to do tailor tacks. And all you need to do with those is you look for each pattern marking. So on this pattern piece D, there's a little circle there that I want to mark. And I get a piece of contrasting thread and I put the thread through that point and then sew a second stitch, just keeping the tails quite long. And once you've done that, you simply just snip the loop and then you can remove the piece of paper very gently and you'll be left with this marking in thread that you can use later, and you're going to be using that to align sewing lines, etc. So if you do that on all of the little circles where it's indicated there are pattern markings, it will make your life a lot easier as you are sewing the pattern. Before we get sewing, we want to make sure that we've added the interfacing to all the pieces that need it. So you're doing it on the wrong side of the fabric. So turn that over. If you need to, press the pieces before you add the interfacing so you're not locking in any creases. Put the glue dotted side down against the fabric and then gently press, working from the centre out on each side, and this just stops it from locking in any creases on the interfacing and the fabric. Once you've done that on one side, just iron out on the other side, just making sure that it's properly stuck on, and then you want to do that on all the pieces that need it. So for this pattern, it's both pieces of A, pocket piece F just on one of the pocket pieces, and then your outer gusset piece of fabric. Now it's time to prepare the pockets. So taking pieces B, C, B2 and C2, you want to firstly turn them onto their wrong side. Turn the fabric down 1.5 centimetres and give it a press all the way along. Then do the same again, so another 1.5 centimetres down and press it all the way along. Clip or pin those pieces in place and then do the same thing on all 4 pocket pieces, and then we'll head to the sewing machine. And we're just going to top stitch all the way along. Now ideally you will sew it so that you're sewing it on the right side of the fabric, which means you're not going to be able to actually see the edge that you're sewing along, but I follow the 1.5 centimetre positioning on my plate, and then I can sew in a straight line and I know that I'm going to be sewing correctly if I keep following that all the way down. You can also feel the kind of lump of where the fold is with your fingers, so use that to guide you, because it is better if you are top stitching it this way rather than sewing it on the other side. At the beginning and the end you want to just do a little back stitch, check the stitching, and then repeat this on all 4 pocket pieces. Top tip, and you don't have to do this, but I do pin the pattern piece back onto the piece that I have just sewn. It just makes it easier to keep track of which piece that you're sewing on throughout the pattern make. Moving on to the pocket flap. Take your 2 pocket flap pieces, place them right sides together and align them with the centre top notch, and then pin or clip them together. Mark a gap along the top straight edge of about a couple of centimetres, which is where you're going to turn the whole piece the right side out before we go to the machine and sew around, and you can follow the interfacing line, and it's 1 centimetre seam allowance. We're stitching with a standard 2.5 stitch length. Starting to the right hand side of that gap you've just left, we're doing a little back stitch to start. When you get to the corner, you want to keep your needle in and pivot, and then come down and just take your time going around the curved edge, because you don't want a really abrupt edge if you're pivoting, because that will show up when you turn it the other way out. So I just do a couple of stitches, just do a small pivot, a couple more stitches, pivot before I get onto the straight edge, and then do the same on the other rounded edge corner. When you get back to the other side of the opening, just do another little back stitch just to lock those stitches in place. And before we turn it the right side out, we want to trim and clip the corners. So trim the corners first and just make sure you don't snip into the stitches. Trim round the curved edge and then just do some little notches around the curved corners, and that will just make sure that it sits nice and flat when you've turned it the right side out. Put your thumb inside and then just ease it through.
Head to the machine,
and then once you've got all of the
5mm
fabric through, use a Hera marker or
like
a chopstick just to make sure the corners are really nice and crisp and pointed before going to the iron and giving the whole thing a really good press. Then we're just going to top stitch all the way around, which will close up that gap that we left in the top for the turning. Starting in the top corner, you literally sew straight across about a couple of millimetres from the edge, as close as you're comfortable sewing. When you get to the corner, just pivot with your needle in and then follow it all the way around till you get back to where you started. Trim your threads, and then it's time to attach the popper. On pattern piece B2, you can see the placement of where you want to be putting the one half of the popper, and then you'll have your mark that you made earlier. If you've forgotten to do the mark, make sure you positioning it from the bottom up, not the top down, because obviously the top is now shorter since you folded it over and top stitched it. Now you want to get your cam snaps. Now if you haven't got a cam snap, you could do this with a button and a buttonhole. It's entirely up to you. I'm not going to go into how to do cam snaps here. I have got a specific video on my YouTube channel just on how to do cam snaps. If you're not sure how to do them, do check that out. We're going to attach the flap half of the cam snap first. So I use an awl just to create the hole, and then I can remove the tailor tack thread because I won't need it anymore. And then I just simply complete putting the cam snaps together. So you want one half, then turn it over, put the other half in, and then using your device, which should have come with the cam snaps that you bought. If you bought a set, then give it a really good squeeze and just check it's all attached correctly. And then you're just attaching the other half to the panel. So again, using an awl to make the hole, you can attach your cam snap, and that's the opposite side of the snap so that they popper into each other. I'm sure there's probably a technical way of describing all of this, but hopefully if you're following and watching this, it'll make sense. Now it's time to attach the tool pockets to the outer panels. So taking one of your A panels and put that right side facing up to you, and then your panel B, your tool pocket, you want to put that wrong side against the right side of the A panel. And you want to line it up with the edges and the centre notch at the top that you've made. Pin or clip that in place. Then we just want to simply mark a line from that centre notch up to the tailor tack mark that we've made. It's easy for me because I've got stripy material, so I can just follow the line. But if you haven't, then you can just get a heat erasable pen or some tailor's chalk and draw that line in just to make sure that you sew it in a completely straight line. At the sewing machine, just starting and stopping with a little back stitch, so all the way up that line that you've just made, stopping at the top mark. When you get to the top, do a good few back stitches forward and back just to really reinforce that edge of the pocket, and it will look like this. And now we're going to attach the smaller pocket to the larger pocket, and look at the pattern pieces and you'll see that there's numbers that correspond. Once you get your head round this, it all makes sense. But it's really important that you have marked those positions on your pattern pieces. Before we start, fold the back A panel out of the way because you only want to be sewing the small pocket to the tall pocket, not to the back A panel for the moment. Now I've clipped the notches where it's 1, 2, 3 and so on, but just so it's really clear, you can go in and just add a little bit of marker pen just to make sure that you are aligning the correct pieces to the back pocket. So starting at point 3, align the number 3 that's on the pattern piece B2 with the number 3 that is on the taller back pocket piece B. Once you're happy that they're aligned, pin either side of that so that you can sew up that line without the pins getting in the way, and then draw a line in so that you can follow that whilst you're sewing, and that will stop at the top of that short front pocket. Making sure you've still got the back panel A folded out of the way, so you're only sewing the short front pocket to the tall back pocket, starting at the bottom with just a little back stitch to lock in those stitches, sew all the way up the line that you've just drawn, and then you want to stop when you get to the top of that short front pocket. And as you did before, just do a good 2 or 3 back stitches just to really secure the top of that pocket. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing as we've just done, but this time we're going to be aligning point 2 to point 2 on the back pocket. And this is where it should start making sense, because by aligning these, it's creating the depth that you need in the pocket to hold, and the pockets that you're creating are to hold things like larger glue pens, etc. So I just clip that kind of bulging fabric out of the way and then do exactly what we did before. So aligning point 2 to point 2, pinning it in place before drawing a sewing line from point 2 up to the tailor tack at the top of that front short pocket. And then head to the sewing machine and sew that in place. Once you've done that, you can stay at the machine, and now we're just going to sew a 0.5 centimetre seam allowance on that right hand side just to secure the edge of the short pocket to the edge of the larger, taller pocket behind. So it's starting to come together. You've got the side attached, you've got the 2 larger kind of utensil pockets in place, and then we can now turn to the other side. find position 4, and we're going to do exactly the same as we've just done. So pinning and clipping, and you can take the flap off to keep that out of the way for now, and then pin it in place and draw a line that you're going to sew along up from the bottom to the tailor tack mark that you've made at the top. So again, that you've got a straight sewing line. Head to the machine and sew that in place. If you want to attach a label to the front of your pouch, now is the time to do it. I just use a simple basting glue just to position it in place in the centre before heading to the machine and sewing it in place. Next step is to sew your pocket flap to the tool back pocket. So using the positioning marks that you've transferred from your pattern, simply pin that in place and then head to the machine, and you're going to sew along the top stitch, go down about 3mm, pivot, go all the way along, and then that will just create a long rectangle to secure it in place. Now it's time to attach the front and back tool pockets to the back A panel at the sides. So simply line up those edges and pin or clip them in place down both the right and the left hand sides. And then all that's left is to finish the pleats. So have a look at the pattern, and I make a little notch at where the pleats start and the direction that they fold into. You then just fold on that little notch into the centre of the pleat. It's probably easier to have a look at the video to see what I'm doing, so I just take my time. It is a little bit fiddly just to make sure that everything's sitting flat, but once you're happy it is, just keep clipping and or pinning those in place, and then just making sure that the pleats are nice and straight up the pocket, and just keep going all the way across. And when you get to the side, it doesn't fold right out to the 5mm seam line that you've just sewn. It folds out to the 1cm, and that's really important because you want to make sure that that side of that pocket isn't getting stitched into the seam allowance. Once you're happy, we're just going to head to the machine and sew those in place. Now we're going to sew with a 1cm seam allowance. I do like to use an awl so I can keep my fingers out of the way, but I can use that to just make sure that the pleat is staying flat as the presser foot moves over it, and that just keeps everything nicely aligned once you've moved your clip or your pin out of the way. Once you're happy, just take your time and just sew all the way across, starting and stopping with a back stitch to really lock those stitches in. Now it's time for the back pockets, which are thankfully a lot easier than the front ones. So taking your tool back pocket C, you want to clip that in place against the second A panel that you've got and just align those centre notches. And as we've done before, we're just going to mark that centre line and then go to the sewing machine and sew that in place. And again, remember to do a good 2 or 3 back stitches at the top just to really secure them. Once you've done that, take your shorter back pocket, so C2 pattern piece, and again align that, and now this time you just want to mark the notch for the smaller side pocket. Again, fold the panel A out of the way because you just want to be stitching the front short pocket to the tool back pocket, and again mark that stitching line and sew that in place. So at the machine, just make sure again that that A panel is folded out of the way, so you're just stitching the short pocket onto the tall pocket. If you've still got your tailor tacks in, you can actually remove them now because you've transferred the markings and you're in mid-stitch, and it just makes it a bit easier rather than stitching in the tailor tacks, which makes them a little bit harder to remove afterwards. Once you've done that, all we now need to do is sew those 2 front pockets to the A back panels. So clip along both sides and along the bottom edge before heading to the machine and sewing all the way around with a 1cm seam allowance. Now it's time to get on to the lining pockets. Now you've got pattern pieces D and D2. One of them gives you 2 pockets and one gives you 3 pockets. If you want 2 of 3 pockets, just do 2 of that one. If you want 2 of 2 pockets, likewise, you can do whatever suits you. But I'm going to show you here how to do both the 2 and the 3 pocket versions. The first thing that we want to do on both of the pieces is to give them a good press, so they're folded in half, wrong sides together, and then we're going to go to the machine and top stitch along that top folded edge. You're just sewing with a 1/4 inch or a 1/2 centimetre top stitch all the way along. Do that on both pieces and it will look like this. Now the same principle applies for your lining pockets as it did for the outer ones. You're simply matching up the numbers with the pattern pieces. So taking your lining panel piece A and your D pocket piece, so the one that we're going to sew 2 pockets onto, you want to take your D piece and first we're going to align number 9 with number 9, which is super easy on the 2 pocket piece because that's actually also the centre notch. Once you've found those, just pin either side and then draw your sewing line up to the top of that front pocket piece. Then head to the sewing machine and stitch that in place. Then pin or clip the sides of the pockets to the A panel piece. Do that on both sides before we head to the sewing machine to sew those in place. And on these sides, once again, we're sewing these with a 1/2 centimetre or 1/4 inch seam allowance just on both sides. Then whilst you're at the machine, you can simply finish off the pleats because these are very simple. You're just doing the side ones and the 2 in the middle. I'll show you how to do it in more detail on the 3 pocket one. So if you can't remember how to do it, watch that and the same thing will apply to this. Once you've sewn those in place, it will look like this. You'll have your nice stitching across the bottom, which has created those 2 pockets with the gussets. So now it's time to do your 3 pocket lining piece. So taking your second A lining piece and your D2 pocket, again, you're going to be aligning this time the 11 and the 12 positions. So as we've done before, just find those pieces and just draw your sewing line. Do that on both points 11 and 12. Align the 2 pieces at position 12 and pin or clip those in place. And do the same at position 11. Pin the top of the pocket pieces as well at the marks from the pattern, and then you're going to sew up exactly the same way as you've done on all the other pieces. So at the machine, you're literally sewing from the bottom up to the top, and again, particularly on these lining pieces because they haven't got interfacing, make sure you do a really good few back tacks at the top of each pocket piece before you cut the thread, just to really secure those pieces in so that when you put things in the pockets, they don't easily start coming apart. Once you've done that, we just need to pin or clip the sides together, so of the A panel and the pocket piece. Do that on both sides before heading to the machine and sewing those up once again with a 1/2 centimetre seam allowance. And then all that's left is to finish the pleats. So exactly the way you've done on all the other pocket pieces, you just want to fold the pleats in the direction that's indicated on the pattern pieces. Again, on the side, make sure that you're not taking the pleat right to the edge, you're taking it to the 1 centimetre line. Just fiddle around with it, make sure you're happy that everything's lying nice and flat, and then just sense check it against the pattern piece. So number 10 to 10, 12, 11 and 8. Then sew those in place with a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way across the bottom. And again, I'm using my awl just to make sure that those pleats stay nice and flat and aligned once I move my clip out of the way. And now you've finished your 2 lining pieces with 2 and 3 pockets. So now you've got your 2 outer panels and your 2 lining panels. You just need to choose which ones you want to match together. I like to put the 3 pockets on the outer panel opposite the one with the pocket flap on. So I just line those up so I know which one goes with which, and now we're going to attach the zip. Taking your zip, if you're using one like me that's from zip tape, then I've just sewn across the 2 ends just to stop the zip pull from coming off. What you want to do is fold it in half first just to find the centre. When you've got that, you want to clip both sides of it because you'll need to be able to line up the centre of the zip with the centre of each panel. Take your first outer panel and place your zip right sides down against the right side of the outer panel. Line the centre notches up with that clip that you've just made to mark the centre of the zip, and then work your way along, clipping or pinning the top of the zip to the top of the panel. Once you've done that, take your corresponding lining piece and you want to face that right sides down so that the right side of the lining is facing the right side of the outer panel. Then do the same as you just did, so aligning the centre notches, clip or pin that lining panel piece from the centre outwards all the way along so that you've created a zip sandwich. So the zip is nicely enclosed and aligned between the outer panel and the lining panel. When you're happy everything aligns, we can go to the machine and sew that in. I've switched out my presser foot for my zip foot, and you can feel where the ridge of the zip is, and you want to be sewing roughly along the middle of that zipper tape. so that you're not going too close to the zip teeth, but you're also not going too close to the top edge. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just using my awl just to make sure that everything stays aligned as I go along. Once you get to the zip pull, you can stop with your needle in, lift and then pull the zip pull out of the way, because you don't want to be trying to sew past it or you'll get a kink in your zip sewing. When you get to the end, just check everything's still aligned before you do a little back tack just to lock in those stitches. Before we move on to the next part, we just want to press where we've just sewn so that's all nice and flat before we top stitch. So just be careful when you're ironing, particularly if you've got a nylon zip, because you don't want to melt the zip. So just go close to it, but don't iron over it. Now, to help keep the lining and everything out of the way before we sew the other side of the zip, I just pop a couple of clips at the bottom to keep the lining and the outer together, and then we're going to move on to the next bit. So taking your second outer panel, you want to place that right size down against the other outer panel and again align the centre notches. This time you're aligning the outer panel with the top edge of the zip. So just ignore my interfacing there because I caught it with the iron. Clip or pin that all the way along. I do find clips easier with this than using pins, but it's entirely up to you. Then once you've done that, flip the whole thing over and take your second lining piece. And again, you're aligning those right sides together and making sure everything's aligned on the sides before lining up the centre notch at the top, and then clipping and pinning that all the way along. And again, you've created a zip sandwich. So just open it up and just check everything looks like it's sitting in the right place and that you're sewing that on the right side of the zip. So you'll be able to see it on both sides. And then we're going to sew that in place in exactly the same way as we did the other side of the zip. So starting and stopping with the back tack, stop with your needle in and move your zip pull out of the way before carrying on, and then going all the way along. Again, I'm using an awl, making sure that the top of the lining and the top of the panel stay aligned when I move my clips out of the way. And then give that a good press once you've finished before we go to the machine and we're going to top stitch. So you simply line up your zipper foot with the top edge of the outer panel and just follow that all the way along, and I use that as a guide so that it's just making sure that the panels are being fixed in place so they don't get kind of in the way of your zip when you're opening and closing it, and it also gives it a really nice neat finish. And then just repeat your top stitch on the other side, and then you'll have finished putting your zip into your pouch, and we can move on to the next step. Okay, moving on to the pouch tabs, pattern piece G. Take your two pieces and place them right sides down, then fold it in half and give that a good press. Open that out and fold the outside edge into that line you've just created. Give that a good press before turning it around and doing exactly the same thing the other side. Give that a press and then fold those two pieces into each other. And what you're doing here is you're enclosing the raw edges into the tab before we sew that closed. Do the same thing on the other tab and then head to the sewing machine. Remember to change your foot back to your normal presser foot, and then we're just going to top stitch along that open edge, starting and stopping with the back stitch and then doing exactly the same thing on the other tab. When you're done, they should look like this. Now we're going to attach them to the outer panels. What I do is trim off the zip ends, anything that's overhanging to start with. Just make sure that the zip pull is in the centre and not off one end. And then once you're happy you've done that, you want to take one of your tabs and simply fold it in half. There isn't a right or a wrong side now because you've sewn all of the wrong edges into each other. So fold it in half and place it either side of the zip tape and just align it with the edge before clipping that in place. Once you've done one, just turn it round and do the other one, and then we're going to head to the sewing machine. We're sewing with about a 1/2 centimetre seam allowance so that we're within the overall seam allowance, and then I do use my awl again just to make sure that that tab doesn't slip and it stays nice and close to the zip teeth, and then I do go back and forward quite a few times just to really lock those tabs in and make sure they're secure in the pouch. And if you wanted to add a handle to this, they'd be strong enough to be able to carry that. When you've sewn in one end, just turn it round and do the other in exactly the same way. And when you're done, they should look like this. So now it's time to start sewing in the gusset panels. So taking your outer gusset panel, placing that right sides up, manoeuvre what you've just sewn so you've got your outer panels facing each other right sides together and your lining panels right sides together. And then what we're going to do is we're going to mark 1 centimetre in and 1 centimetre up on the wrong side of one of your outer panels. Do this on both sides. Take your gusset piece and you just want to mark the centre notch. Now ignore the seam in my gusset piece, I just had to put 2 pieces together because I didn't have quite enough material. But mark that centre notch and then you're going to take one of the outer panels and you're going to align the top of that panel right sides together with the right side of that centre notch on your gusset piece. And you'll be able to see what I'm doing here. You've moved your other outer panel out of the way, so you're just attaching one of the outer panels to this side of the gusset piece for now. Pin or clip that all the way along before heading to the sewing machine, where we're going to sew starting and stopping at that 1 centimetre dot mark. So at the machine, put your needle in at the dot mark that you've made and just do a little back stitch before sewing all the way along. We're doing a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and if you've done your interfacing correctly, you can pretty much follow the line of that because that was also cut 1 centimetre in from the edge of the panel. Keep going till you reach that other 1 centimetre dot and then do a little back stitch to lock those stitches in place. And what you'll have is it will look like this. You've done your stitch, and so you've got the gusset panel. You want to fold that out, flip the whole thing over, and then take that gusset panel and align the right side of that with the right side of the other outer panel. And again, if you look at what I'm doing here, it will make sense. Pin or clip those in place, and then we're going to do exactly the same as we did before. So we're going to just turn it round, and on the other side that we're going to be stitching on, we're just going to mark 1 centimetre in and 1 centimetre up on each of the corners. Then we're going to head to the machine and we're going to sew along again, starting and stopping at that 1 centimetre dot mark. And now it's time to do exactly the same process with the lining gusset piece. So again, fold it in half, right sides together, and mark the centre notch before opening that out, right sides facing you, and then taking one of the lining pieces and you're pinning that and clipping it in place, right sides together with the top of that gusset piece, marking the 1 centimetre mark on each of the corners before pinning or clipping all the way along and heading to the sewing machine to sew along that line. When you've done that, open it out and then flip it open like you did before, and we're now going to align the other side of that gusset lining piece right sides together with the other side of the lining panel. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm aligning it at the centre notch first, just to make sure that the edges are properly aligned. I'm marking my 1 centimetre start and stop stitch point before I pin or clip all the way along. And then exactly the same way as we did before, we're just starting and stopping with the back stitch at that 1 centimetre mark before we sew all the way along to the other end and back stitch to finish that off. And you'll now have both gusset pieces sewn into the core panel pieces that they align to. Now we're going to sew the gusset to the zip ends. So making sure everything's nicely aligned, taking your outer gusset and lining it up with the end of the zip. So lining up your centre notch of the gusset with the centre of your zip tape, and then pinning and clipping all the way across there. Once you've done that one side, then flip it round and do exactly the same on the other sides. Then you want to flip the whole thing over, and you're now going to attach the gusset lining pieces to the bits that you've just attached. So again, aligning the centre notches of the lining gusset with the outer gusset, and with the zip sandwiched in between each of those, just clip or pin those in place. Do the same on the other side, and then we're going to head to the sewing machine and we're going to sew it all up. This bit is now quite thick, so just take your time, and we're starting and stopping with a back stitch. We're sewing with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, and we're sewing right across the zip. You can either go back and forward here, or you can get to the end, lock it in, check everything has sewn together correctly before going and sewing the whole thing again. So you can see here I'm just checking that every layer has been stitched in, and then I'm going back in and I'm just giving it a really good stitch all the way across, back stitching a little bit across the zip just to make sure all of that's locked together well. Once you've done that on one end, you just flip it round and do exactly the same thing on the other side. Now this bit's probably the fiddliest bit, and it's just where we're going to sew up the sides. Now those bottom corners, they obviously don't want to naturally turn because you're putting a corner on a square corner. And this is where we left the 1 centimetre gap, because what you want to do is simply clip a diagonal, don't go into the stitches, but clip a diagonal so that you can ease that fabric around the corner and pin or clip it in place. And you're going to do that on both the outer gussets and the lining gusset pieces. So if you see what I'm doing here, you just want to do a simple clip just to help ease those gusset pieces around the corners. Once you've done these diagonal clips, you want to turn the whole thing through the lining. As you do it, just smooth it all down. And then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be aligning the outer panels and the lining panels at those corner edges and then pinning and clipping them before we sew them. The first thing I clip is I align those outer pockets so the top of the pockets are aligned with each other. I move the internal pockets and the external pockets out of the way, so I'm just sewing the seam allowance, and then I clip those together. Then I move on to the top bit, and I just, with my finger, just make sure that the outer panel and the lining panel are all nicely aligned, clip that in place. And then this is the fiddliest one, so you just want to turn out the lining, and where you've put that notch in both the lining and the outer panels, you just want to guide it and make sure that there's nothing kind of rucked up and you've just got a nice flat piece of fabric against each other. So again, it's probably easier to see what I'm doing here. Just maneuver it until you've got as clean a connection and bend round that corner as you can. I hope this makes sense. When you're doing it, it will do. Take your time and do all 4 of those corners and clip them before we go to the sewing machine to sew them in place. And you can see how by doing that, it's creating the nice boxy corner of your pouch. So I like to sew with the bulk of my pouch to the left of my sewing so that I can easily move my clips out of the way. And then you're sewing with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, just taking your time again because this is quite thick. And just again, you can see here, I'm just kind of pulling the fabric and just making sure that all of the panels are as nice and flat as possible. When you get to that corner, again, just hold that straight and then just sew right into that corner and go backwards and forwards a few times. When you've done that, the best thing to do is before you do all of them, just have a look. You can see because you've snipped into that corner, you are going to be stitching quite close to where you've snipped. So the thing I do is I turn it the right side out just to check that all of that edge has been sewn in, particularly around that corner bottom bit. If you've got any bits showing or it hasn't closed properly, just go back and just stitch it again. Once you're happy, you then just need to sew up all the other 4 corners. Once you've checked and you're happy that all of those sides and corners have sewn up correctly, just check all of them at the top and the bottom, then it's time to now move on to create the covers for those raw edges. Taking your 4H pattern pieces, we're going to do exactly the same as we did for the pouch tabs. So you want to give them a good press, then fold them wrong sides together along the long edges, open it out, press the raw edges into the middle fold line, turn it round and do the same on the other side, and then once you've pressed that, you fold them again into each other and you're creating, in effect, your own bias binding. Now, we haven't had to cut these on the bias because they're not long enough strips and they're not needing to go around any corners or anything. Trim off any loose threads just so that you're keeping that raw edge nice and neat before you bind it. So just working on one corner edge at a time, just fold everything else out of the way, make sure the pockets are well out of the way. Taking one of your pieces and right sides together with the corner edge, you want to align that. Just make sure you've got an equal overhang on each end. That's what you're going to wrap around the end to cover the corners. And then just make sure that the pockets underneath are well out of the way so you're not stitching them in. Once you're happy, you just need to pin or clip all the way along, and then we're going to head to the sewing machine to sew that bit of the binding in place. Before I start sewing, I'm just making sure that the pocket underneath is well out of the way, and then we're sewing with a 1 centimetre seam allowance, starting and stopping with a back stitch, and you don't need to sew from the very end because that's obviously the bit that's going to fold over and enclose all of the end edges. So if you follow what I'm doing here, it will make sense. Double check on the other side that you didn't catch any of the pocket, and then flip it back the way you've just been sewing. And then what we're going to do now is just enclose the rest of those raw edges. So starting at one end, fold the overhang piece in first before rolling up the rest of the binding to cover over that raw edge. So it's exactly the same as you do with bias binding. Once you've done that, just clip or pin that in place and then do the same thing on the other end before then doing the rest of the length of the raw edge. And you can use as many clips or pins as you need and just make sure everything's nicely aligned before we then go to the sewing machine to sew it up. And all you're doing is sewing as close to that edge as you can just to secure it in place. And just make sure you do a little back stitch at the beginning and the end. Now, I have kept this in the edit because it shows you what you need to do to make sure that you haven't sewn the pocket into the binding, which is what I did here. And so it's an easy fix. You just basically need to unpick the bit that you have sewn in, because you can see here I kept most of it out of the way, but the bit at the top got caught. So you just unpick it with your quick unpick and then just sew that bit of binding again. Repeat that on all 4 corners and then you are done. You have made your Curious Pouch. Turn it the right side out, push out all of the corners and get rid of any loose threads before zipping it up and admiring your handiwork. I really hope you enjoyed this sew along. If you did, check out the other patterns on my website.